So, welcome to the first in a series of macro guides for World of Warcraft. Today's guide is going to focus on Death Knights. I know I promised this guide last week, but I had some health issues over the weekend which were out of my control. All of the content in this guide has been checked on both the live servers and the beta servers to ensure that it will work into Shadowlands, and as a little extra, I've even included macros for class and covenant abilities where they are required, and they function as they currently stand on the beta. There may be changes between now and launch, and I'm going to use this format going forward for all class guides, so please do let me know what you think about this. Death Knights are one of the easier classes to play if you have a motor impairment, because currently there is a lack of click and cast spells on Frost. However, that is going to change somewhat in Shadowlands, with Anti-Magic Zone and Death and Decay becoming baseline abilities, and some of the Covenant and class abilities also require click and cast functionality. Venthir immediately springs to mind. So where do we start? I think the first macros we want to look at are those for interrupts. Depending on your talent choices, you may have between 1 or 3 interrupts. Mind Freeze is a default class ability, Asphyxiate is a talent, and Strangulate is a PvP talent. There are numerous ways to macro these abilities, from a basic simple cast macro to a focus cast macro, or even a focus target macro if you can afford 3 separate buttons on your toolbars. You could put all of these into one macro using a priority system, remembering of course that it won't take into account whether or not the target is casting, just whether a target has been identified that exists and is hostile. And that might look something like this. But on the beta, because of the lack of add-ons available to me, I started experimenting with a different macro that looks like this. And what I've done is I've assigned Mind Freeze to F1, and the modifiers in the macro directly act as keybinds. So Shift and F1 will cast at a focus target, Control and F1 will cast at whatever my focus is targeting, and if I don't press anything other than F1, it will target my own personal target. This does rely on a lot of memory and practice to get used to, which may be something that a neurodiverse player may struggle with. With Ray's Ghoul becoming baseline across all 3 specs of Death Knight, another interrupt previously only used by DKs in the last couple of expansions has become available for everyone, and that is the Leap Gnaw macro combo. What this does is it sets your Ghoul to leap to a target and immediately casts Gnaw, which stuns them for 1 second. Now this stun isn't huge, but it can be used in a close situation to interrupt a spell cast from maybe a healer in arena or a mage who's blinked away from you. Being able to cast Death Grip on a mouse over target is always useful. Say you've pulled a group of bards that include a caster, and that caster is standing at a distance. You want to continue doing your AoE without changing target, and at the same time pull that caster into the mix, and that's really a useful place to have a mouse over macro. Now obviously, if you have motor impairment issues like I do, getting the cursor over the mob that you want to target and pressing the button can be difficult, so I've modified my macro like this. What this macro basically does is it will cast at the mouse over target if I've got one, and if I don't have one, it will cast at my target. Now this means that if I accidentally click on the mob that I'm mousing over, that becomes my target, and it allows me to pull that in. Death Knights can be faced with a similar issue when we look at the new base ability Anti-Magic Zone. Having this on a /cast at player macro will simply reduce this to a one button press, and it'll make it much easier to use, especially in content like Torghast if you're doing a lot of soloing. If you find that you're doing more group content, you can still cast like this from this macro, but you may want to add a little line just to tell people you've put it down, just in case the big glowy bubble isn't visible to them. I generally don't recommend using anti-magic shell and anti-magic zone in the same macro because they have different functionality. One is a personal cooldown, one is a group cooldown. However, if you find that you're pressing anti-magic shell a lot when it's on cooldown, then a macro like this could help. What this macro does is it casts anti-magic shell the first time you press it, and then it moves along the sequence to anti-magic zone the next time you cast it, casting it centered on yourself. But the reset parameter of 60 is 60 seconds, which is 1 minute, which is the cooldown of anti-magic shell. Resets the cast sequence every 60 seconds, so once it's pressed, 60 seconds later it will reset back to the beginning, and this means that provided you don't hammer the button, you will basically only ever be casting anti-magic shell. But in a clutch situation where you may need some magic protection and you're hammering that button, it will make sure that anti-magic zone goes up. All Death Knight specs are going to benefit from a macro to place Death and Decay in Shadowlands. It's now baseline across all specs, and for the most part, given in Shadowlands that you're going to want to stand in your Death and Decay, I use a simple @player macro to cast the spell centered on myself. You could modify the macro to use the modifier to allow you to place it normally. Should you choose, that would look something like this, allowing you to place it with a reticule by holding down Alt when you press the key for Death and Decay. It is worth noting, if you choose to take your DK into the service of the Night Fae, Death and Decay is replaced with Death's Dues, at which point your Death and Decay macros won't function, and you'll need a new set of macros where you just replace Death and Decay with Death's Dues, and it will function in exactly the same way. Another good use for an alt modifier is to change between casts of spells that you're using in single target and in AoE. A good example of this would be to shift between Obliterate and Frost Scythe on Frost Decay, or between Blood Boil and Death's Caress on Blood Decay. These two macros can save you a bit of space on your toolbars. Again, the same proviso about remembering the keybinds is recommended. Using macros like this is really useful, because you aren't going to be casting Obliterate and Frost Scythe at the same time, or Blood Boil and Death's Caress at the same time. I do put out a small warning though. Frost Scythe will cast irrespective of whether you have a target in front of you, so just make sure you don't end up burning up runes and not hitting anything. Another way that you can macro two abilities together that's useful for a Blood DK is by putting Rune Tap and Blood Tap into a macro together. Now, the order in which you put these two spells in the macro is important. If you put Blood Tap in first and then you activate the macro at 6 runes, you won't generate a rune and your cast of Blood Tap will be wasted. Whereas if you put Rune Tap into the macro first and you don't have a rune to use, then the Rune Tap won't go off and then the Blood Tap will go off, generating a rune. This can be a useful macro. I have used it myself when tanking, but largely all this does is effectively negates the cost of Rune Tap if you have to use it. Now, I added an alt modifier also to the Venthea Door of Shadows ability. If you go down the Venthea route, you'll get Door of Shadows, which is a teleport ability, which teleports to a cursor location. Much like with the Death and Decay macro I was talking about earlier, you may want to have the option to see the cursor, in which case Alt plus your shortcut key will cast it with the cursor intact, or if you press just the shortcut ability, it will cast it directly at the cursor location on the screen. I found that I rarely needed to use the reticule to know where I was targeting it, but you may feel differently. If you decide to go down the Maldraxxus route, you may find yourself wanting to use a control undead spell on the abundance of undead that are inhabiting that area. I've set up this macro, allowing me to, much like the macros before, cast it at a mouse over target, but just in case I accidentally click on it, I've set it up also to cast at target. And if you're going to be on a Holy Death Knight, then you can also benefit from an oldie but goodie macro to cast Death Coil to heal your pet. That's the macro that's being shown on the screen right now. This is one I use. It does allow you to cast at your pet by holding down Alt, or to cast at your target with a straight cast. Speaking of dead things, there are occasions when unfortunately one of your allies may go down in combat and you'll need to cast Raise Ally as a battle res. This macro ensures you can do this without changing your target. Personally, as I've said with other macros in the past, any mouse over macro in the past, I do have mine set up to have an extra at target on the end, just in case I accidentally click on whatever I'm mousing over. But obviously the idea in World of Warcraft is, of course, not to die, so self-healing macros are important. The obvious choice is to take Transfusion as a PvP talent, and then you can macro it into your Death Strike like this. This effectively creates a free Death Strike whenever Transfusion is available, but it does mean that you run the risk of not having Transfusion available during a clutch moment when you may really need it. But there are other ways to get that clutch heal off. One way to get 25% of your hit points back is to use a cast sequence macro that casts Raise Dead and Sacrificial Pact like this. Obviously this macro is most useful to Frost Decay and Blood Decay, and if you're playing Unholy, you're also already going to have your pet out, so you may want to reverse the order, sacrificing the pet you have and then raising a new one. And of course, another returning macro is of course the Lichborne Death Coil Self-Heal. Lichborne turns your DK into an undead character, thus allowing you to cast Death Coil on yourself as a heal. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're popping Lichborne and you need a heal, then a macro like this is a great way to do that. You don't need to do this in a cast sequence macro because Lichborne is off the global cooldown, but you still will need the 40 runic power to cast the Death Coil. Now, as I've shown all the other class abilities, what you're seeing there is a wee glimpse of the Bastion class ability, so no one can accuse me of favoritism. These are the macros that I've been using on the beta right now, and all the macros function reasonably well on a controller. Obviously mouse over macros are difficult to use with a controller, but they aren't impossible with a bit of creativity. It's nice to see some of the older macros making a comeback in Shadowlands. I've really enjoyed playing on the beta when I've got the chance. And I hope this guide proved useful to you and will help you with setting up macros on live and into Shadowlands. I'd be very interested in hearing about any macros that you are using or ways that you have macroed abilities differently to how I have. So please do leave them in the comments for everyone to see, or you can contact me at Warcraft on Twitter. Until next time, please do